No, disappeared. Hello, hello.
We set? Okay. Glitch is cleaned up. We're ready to go. The commission will come to order, and I want to welcome all of you to this hearing on addressing ethnic tensions in Kyrgyzstan, the only country in Central Asia where street protests have in recent years twice led to changes in government. Kyrgyzstan is also the only state in Central Asia which has experimented with a parliamentary form of government, so it stands out in those two very important ways. But the focus of today's hearing is the terrible ethnic violence that erupted 1 year ago this month, shortly after the April Revolution that toppled former President Bakiyev, and what the government of Kyrgyzstan should do to address it. On June 2010, ethnic Kyrgyzstan and ethnic Uzbeks clashed in the southern region of Osh. By the time the worst was over, 470 people were dead and over 400,000 displaced. Thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed. The clashes drew a dark shadow on the hopes engendered by the ouster of the corrupt Bakiyev government. To its credit, the government of Kyrgyzstan requested an international investigation into the events, and I certainly commend President Otunabayev for that initiative. A response to the Independent International Commission of Inquiry into the events of southern Kyrgyzstan in June of 2010 was formed. It released its report last month, and our first witness will be Kimmo Kilyunen, who chaired that commission. And it's an excellent report. I am deeply concerned by its conclusions. Especially alarming is the Commission's judgment that the systematic nature of some acts committed last June by ethnic Kyrgyzstanis against ethnic Uzbeks, including patterns of murder, rape, and brutal ethnic persecution, could qualify as crimes against humanity. It remains to be seen whether they will be found so in a court of law, and whether or not a competent court might take on the case. In any case, such a judgment by such a credible commission of investigation must be taken seriously, and the government of Kyrgyzstan must investigate these crimes seriously and hold those responsible to account. I am also disturbed that the security forces apparently were complicit in the attacks, not only by failing to respond adequately to stop the violence, but according to the Commission's report, in some cases even distributing weapons to ethnic Kyrgyzstanis or driving the armored personnel carriers which penetrated the defense of ethnic Uzbek neighborhoods. Unfortunately, so far, the government has brought more cases against ethnic Uzbeks, who make up the majority of the victims, and there is credible evidence that torture was used to extract confessions from these ethnic Uzbeks. This also must be investigated, including the case of human rights defender Azimjan Askarov, who has been sentenced to life imprisonment despite his credible claim that he was tortured. Just as disturbing is the ongoing serious human rights abuses against ethnic Uzbeks, including torture, arbitrary arrest and detention, and unfairly conducted trials, which also have been covered in detail by the report. Because the police force is deeply involved in these abuses, it is almost entirely made up of those of Kyrgyzstan ethnicity. Victims feel that they have nowhere to turn. Ethnic Uzbek businessmen and migrant workers returning from Russia are particular targets for extortion. Even with the understandable reluctance of victims to report abuses, the Office of the High Commissioner of the UNHCR has documented some 680 cases of arbitrary arrest for ransom since June of 2010, as well as 70 cases of torture in detention. Ongoing human rights violations must stop immediately, and those responsible need to be brought to justice. President Utubenmayov has said many of the right things in recent days. While laying a wreath in Osh to commemorate the one-year anniversary of the violence, she called for inter-ethnic peace and urged that nationalism not be used for political purposes. She has pledged to purge the police forces, reform the judicial system, and fight organized crime. She told the OSCE recently that, quote, in addition to the reconstruction of destroyed facilities, we will also face a far more difficult task to restore the lost trust between both communities in the South. It is not easy to achieve trust after such a complex conflict. The national level of nationalism and intolerance is very high. In the government's comments on the Commission's report, we openly admit, she went on to say, the existence of serious problems in the field of human rights in the post-conflict period. We agree with many criticisms of the Commission in this field. We are ready to change the situation, and we need support in implementing the Commission's recommendations. I would ask, without unanimous consent, that the full statement be made a part of the record, because we are pressed for some time this afternoon. And I would also, without objection, include opening statements from other commissioners, many of whom are on their way here. First, we will hear today from Kimmo, a former member of the Finnish Parliament and currently chairman of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry into the events in southern Kyrgyzstan in June of 2010. He has been a colleague of longstanding at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, a good friend, and a man who has spoken out on human rights everywhere in the OSCE space for many years. And we will now turn to him for his comments. Kimmo.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have to start my short presentation with thanking two things. First, that it wasn't necessary for me to travel to Washington in this time, due to the fact that we do have the coming weekend, starting from tomorrow already, the biggest midsummer festivity in Finland, and I would sacrifice my family to come there. So thanks that we could organize this in this particular way, although obviously I'm not seeing you physically, but we can hear it from each other. And obviously I know you very well already before we have been several times. Second thanks goes to the American government and you personally also, in the way that you have given strong support for the International Inquiry Commission, which I have headed. First, obviously, financially, United States of America was the second biggest financial supporter after the European Union for the Commission's work, as well as political support during the process itself of inquiry. Several experts and competence came from your country, but also very important, of course, after when we have published our report, we have been very pleased that U.S. government has supported it, and even after that episode, which is a bit strange, that the Kyrgyzstan Parliament condemned the report and put me personally as a person non grata, and also ask the prosecutor's office as well as law enforcement authorities to put accountable those people who have helped us in terms of their report preparation inside Kyrgyzstan. These were obviously severe steps, and I'm very pleased that the international community, including the United States government, has condemned that process. So these are the thanks. Then about the Commission itself, the work, and some of our conclusions. If you allow me first to say a few words about characteristics of the inquiry, because it was a bit sui generis type of operation we made. There were several requests by the international community to have an investigation on the events in southern Kyrgyzstan last year. OECD, European Union, several governments, obviously United Nations requested this type of inquiry. But at the end it was done via this type of independent inquiry commission, which obviously used the terms of references of United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, which are typically the references for this type of inquiries when similar type of human rights violations have taken place throughout the world. So we used actually very much the UN type of formula in terms of our mandate, and the members of the Commission were very high caliber, myself, I was heading it, but we had 7 members altogether in the commission, including Ralph Jacklin, the former Assistant Secretary General of United Nations Legal Affairs, Philip Alston, who is the professor in Harvard University from Australia, very famous international lawyer, Rein Müllerson from Estonia, former acting foreign minister of Estonia, and also Vice Chancellor of the Tallinn University, Valery Tishko from Russia, who is a former Minister for National Minorities in Russia and academician, as well as Brigitte Aubet from France, who has been the member of the Court of Appeal, and Akin Ertürk from Turkey, who has been the former UN representative on gender-related violence. So we had a very high-quality commission who worked throughout the period when we started operation at the end of September. We had around 50 researchers, specialists on the field. We had public offices in Osh and Jalalabad, and we were 2.5 months, close to 3 months, working in Kyrgyzstan. And thanks very much for the Kyrgyzstan government that they obviously agreed with the terms, but they also fulfilled the terms. So we had access to information, access to every places where we wanted to go. We could meet every people we wanted inside the country. Obviously, we also made interviews outside the country among the refugees, particularly in Russia, maybe some other countries too. So we made a very extensive inquiry, interviewing over 700 people, and we have lots of audiovisual, other documentary materials in our hands. We finalized the report, so it was released in May, early May this year. CMI, the Crisis Management Initiative, President Ahtisaari's office in Helsinki provided the secretarial technical support for the Commission. So I would say so that it was in that way properly done. Now, some of the conclusions of our report you already mentioned some of the basics, but obviously our task was to study first why this tragedy happened. Secondly, what happened. Obviously, our task was to look at the responsibilities and finally, obviously, make recommendations. And that is roughly the content of the report, and obviously you have had it, and pleased that you have even read it and commented it. In terms of why it happened, of course, the first question in Kyrgyzstan, who started it and when it exactly started. Obviously, the tragedy itself in Osh, the biggest violence period was 10th to 13th or 14th of July last year, but we can say that the whole process started 7th of April when there was an overthrow of the Bakiev regime in Bishkek, and new interim government took place and created and generated, obviously, a power vacuum, particularly in the southern Kyrgyzstan, which is a stronghold for Bakiev's, the previous regime. So obviously, the power vacuum particularly is explaining the political reasons for the tragedy. One must remember that 20 years ago, in 1990, there were similar type of violent tragedy, roughly even same time of the year, June 1990, in Osh. Particularly Osh region and southern Kyrgyzstan. There too it was the same situation, power vacuum, because the Soviet Union was to collapse and was collapsing, and that generated the problem. That was actually 1991, so it was exactly 10 years ago, and that 20 years ago, and that obviously was a major problem and reasons for the tragedy itself. There were 3 major political players which we obviously looked very carefully in terms of political reasons. Obviously, the former supporters of Bakiev regime, who had a stronghold in the southern Kyrgyzstan, they generated during May already several type of violent events in Jalalabad particularly, which created concern. Obviously, the interim government itself has a responsibility in the area, principally controlling, and obviously one must remember that in southern Kyrgyzstan 40% of the population are from Uzbek origin, although in terms of total population it's 14%, but in southern Kyrgyzstan the Uzbek population is large, and obviously Uzbek political leaders start also to be activated, and that created tensions step by step, where I would say so political fanatism used ethnicity as a tool, and that obviously generated the process. There have been obviously, when we are looking, criminal elements and other issues which are related, but that's roughly the political context. What happened? We have a very detailed narrative in our report. I would say so. It's a best account on almost hour by hour, day by day, suburb by suburb, both in Osh and Jalalabad, where we are really describing the terrifying events, what happened. Then comes obviously the questions of the responsibility. Major issue for us was to qualify the crimes committed in terms of humanitarian law. Obviously, the figures you already mentioned that roughly 470 people, not more than 500, were killed. The exact number is still lacking, but roughly on that range it is. You mentioned obviously displaced people. 300,000-400,000, depending how we are calculating that one, or close to 100,000 took a refuge in Uzbekistan. Short time they returned back, and obviously it generated big problems. Lots of property were demolished. 74% of the killed people were Uzbeks. 24% were Kyrgyz. So that was roughly the relations in terms of killings and obviously in the terms of violence. In terms of properties, dwellings particularly, it was primarily Uzbek areas which were destroyed in terms of dwellings. In terms of public properties, obviously it were different parts of the cities, also Kyrgyz properties too. Then in terms of the responsibilities, first issue for us was to qualify it in terms of international law. We clearly came to the conclusion it's not war crime. The second point which was addressed was genocide. The evidence is not enough to say it was a genocide. But in terms of the reasonable suspicion principle we used in terms of our investigation, it was crime against humanity. It was widespread, it was systematic, and against civilian population, particularly, and we addressed that one, particularly attacks in 11th, 12th, and 13th against Uzbek mahallas, Uzbek suburbs. There we can say in Osh that this was crime against humanity, and obviously we need court to take prosecution investigation in order to really, beyond doubt, come to that same conclusion. And then we obviously looked at the responsibilities also individually. The task and mandate for the Commission was very clear. We shouldn't do a criminal investigation. And we couldn't do, obviously. We didn't have the methodologies, competence, and it was not our task either to have a criminal investigation. It's up to the courts in Kyrgyzstan to do, and obviously we asked them seriously to do that. But we obviously looked how much we have evidence in terms of individual responsibilities, and our evidence wasn't enough to say this or that person particularly should be taken to the court. We don't have enough evidence. We know that crimes were committed, particularly lots of crimes in terms of human rights violations were committed, and others too. And obviously the court must take those up, and that's important. Unfortunately, as also you mentioned in your first statement, there have been court cases close to 2,000 already this day, but unfortunately, major part of those court cases are against Uzbeks. I already mentioned that 74% of the victims were Uzbeks in terms of killed people. 80% of the court cases are against Uzbeks, and all who have been condemned up to date are Uzbeks. So it's obviously disproportionately non-balanced procedure, and unfortunately all the cases the major evidence have been confession. And you yourself mentioned, and we have evidence that torture has been used, and obvious that's absolutely major violation against major human rights violations, and that should be addressed seriously by the prosecutor's office in Kyrgyzstan as well as to check the juridical system that it's really working properly in terms of both Kyrgyzstan law and obviously also in terms of international law. These are one of the major parts of our recommendations. Then we look obviously the institutional responsibilities, and of course every government have a responsibility to protect their people. And irrespective of the fact which we know that there were a power vacuum in the southern Kyrgyzstan, nevertheless the interim government have a principal and had a principal responsibility to protect the people, and obviously they failed. The major issue is about the law enforcement bodies and security forces, and there unfortunately we can clearly see that there is a major question mark. Our conclusion is very clearly so that there were actually security forces present in the area, but they were not used properly to protect the people. They protect rather the administrative buildings rather than people, and that obviously is a major failure. Furthermore, clearly there is an evidence that seizure of weapons by troops, military forces, also police forces, is a big question mark and creates a complicity potential. And we are very much asking, the Commission is asking, one of the recommendations is that there must be a very proper prosecution, investigation on the responsibilities of the security forces, law enforcement bodies, particularly addressing the question of seizure of the weapons. And that's a major problem there. Then obviously we recognize also the, let's say, less transparent elements in the society, including the criminal issues, narco trafficking, etc. These type of problematics, which are playing a major role in the southern Kyrgyzstan. Then neither we don't have enough evidence to say this or that gang or this or that group has been responsible, but obviously we can also see their role in terms of the violence. In terms of the recommendations, there are concrete major more than 50 recommendations, starting very concrete issues where we are really asking particularly that strong public stand must be taken by the Kyrgyzstan government and authorities to condemn ethno-nationalism in the country. That's not the way you conduct politics in any country today, and ethnic polarization should be avoided. We are proposing different measures how to improve the relations between ethnic groups in southern Kyrgyzstan, how to improve the position of Uzbeks also in public administration, law enforcement bodies, in police forces, as well as in juridical systems, that it would be more balanced than today. We also address the question of Uzbek language. We are not asking Uzbek to become an official language in the country, but certain type of position for Uzbek language in southern Kyrgyzstan should be recognized more proper way than today. There are lots of recommendations related to the prosecution processes, court cases which should be seriously taken, and we are also recommending the Truth and Reconciliation Commission should be established, hopefully with the international support. Obviously, the reconstruction operation should be it has been already started, obviously we know, but it should be moving further, and obviously also international support is needed there. Then finally, we are also asking the international community to take seriously both our recommendations, which they have taken, and we are pleased on that one, but also asking the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, as well as the High Commissioner for Minorities of OSCE, to establish a monitoring and follow-up systems, and that way support the government of Kyrgyzstan in putting in force our recommendation. Finally, in our report, there is also an annex made by the Kyrgyzstan government. This is typical nowadays in this type of reporting, that there is an annex opinions of the governments on the report. They are quite critical. Obviously, we understand there are certain areas we can dispute, but principally most important is that the government agrees with our conclusions in the way that the recommendations, they are saying that the major part of them they are taking seriously, and the government of Kyrgyzstan is aiming to establish a special commission to implement and monitor our recommendations. And I have already now understood that the international community, European Union, United Nations, OEC, United States, your own country, several governments have supported that initiative and are willing to help Kyrgyzstan government to implement our recommendations and also creating a monitoring system. Finally, I want to come back to where from I started, concerns the decision by Kyrgyzstan Parliament. I see that they took a very critical, why they took very critical position was somewhat related that they wanted to take distance from the Commission's report, which is very, very, very unfortunate, particularly if that distance taking means that they are not supporting the government's effort to implement the recommendations. Because our aim clearly was reconciliation. And that's very pity if that's not recognized. The persona non grata position of myself is a bit pity, but more important is that I cannot agree at all, and this is a major problem. If prosecutor's office or law enforcement bodies start to somewhat harass and as they put accountable those people in Kyrgyzstan who had technically helped our commission's work. I am, and the commission members, we are outside from Kyrgyzstan, but they are really people living in the country who have been very helpful for our work, and it's out of questions that they should be anyway harassed. And I'm very pleased that the President has indicated that's not the case, it cannot go this way, and also has actually indicated that the government itself takes seriously our recommendations and are aiming to implement them. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kiljunen, thank you very much for your report. Thank you for your willingness to come and provide testimony to our commission. You mentioned that you're hoping people will take notice. Well, as you can see by this commission hearing, we have taken notice, and we're hoping to help you to get to the bottom of what happened, and especially an accountability for those who committed, as you put it, these crimes against humanity. I would like to ask you, just in terms of definitions, you know, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the UN Convention, makes it very clear in Article 2 that genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group, and then it goes on with other criteria. In coming to your conclusion that it's a crime against humanity as opposed to genocide, you know, it doesn't have to be the whole group, it could be in whole or in part. Do you think it does rise to the status of being a crime of genocide? And as you recall, we had serious problems during the Balkan Wars of those who would not call, for example, what happened in Srebrenica a crime, a genocide. And I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of definitions, as my first question, thoughts are on that.
Thanks very much for the question. Now I must immediately admit I'm not a lawyer in international humanitarian law. I'm not specialist on that area. So in terms of our report's conclusions on that particular issue, I relied with the high expertise which we had actually in our commission itself. We had actually 4 major lawyers in terms of international law who really looked very, very carefully, conceptually, that issue, genocide, war crime, and crime against humanity. The evidence what we have, as I said, our evidence is obviously based on reasonable suspicion that this is not a court, it's not a tribunal where we are, so it's not a court case itself, but we obviously have evidence. The evidence what we have, I already indicated, in terms of international law, and I'm saying what they are, I'm repeating what they are saying as I'm saying, I'm not a specialist. They say this is not a genocide. It's not in terms of scale itself, in terms of its process itself, it's not qualifying on those terms. When they are looking the concept of crime against humanity, they were also very, very careful on that one. They looked at very carefully the Rome Statute and all those issues, and they clearly, as I indicated you already, the three basic issues and very specific events during that process, during the tragedy, particularly as I said to you, those attacks against Uzbek mahallas in Osh in 11th and between 11th and 13th of June, they were, the way it was done clearly was crime against humanity in terms of the evidence what we have. Why we say so? It was widespread. It was widespread. It was systematic one. It was repeated in the same way in different suburbs, in different mahallas, Uzbek mahallas of the Osh, and same way of organizing the attacks there, and also robbing, burning, and killing, and even there was lots of sexual violence also related, but that's not necessarily one of the elements, but was very systematic one, and also obviously against civilian population. So those indications are obvious, the terms is where you can come to the conclusions crime against humanity.
Let me ask you if
But in terms of genocide, clearly those experts, internal lawyers, say that it wasn't on that scale.
You mentioned that you're hoping that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pillay, will do something in response to the report. One, have they done anything? Has the Human Rights Council done anything in response to your report? And with regards to the ICC, as we all know, one of the criteria is that whether or not there's a competence and a willingness on the part of the government where these alleged crimes have occurred to prosecute, investigate, and prosecute adequately and then incarcerate those who have committed these crimes. We know that places like Kenya, countries like Kenya, are arguing that they have the capacity and the willingness and the capability to do so, and yet the ICC is still, asking for certain people who have committed very, very serious crimes there. Do you believe that the Kyrgyz judicial system has the ability to prosecute and to bring to justice those who have committed the crimes?
First, concerning the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, they have contributed very strongly from the start to our investigation. The terms were really even. We got them from their sources. They helped us to formulate the mandate for the Commission, and in terms of expertise in the Commission work, we were relying very much on their knowledge. Very pleased we were, obviously, when our report was released, that Madame Pillay herself, immediately, she was maybe one of the first ones to react positively to our report, and in Human Rights Council meeting in Geneva a few weeks ago, as you know, you mentioned, it was clearly mentioned our report as one of those key documents, and High Commission for Human Rights indicated that the follow-up work in terms of the High Commissioner's work inside Kyrgyzstan will look at our recommendations, and that way they are very supportive. As regards to ICC, the International Criminal Court, then we have a bit different situation now concerning Kyrgyzstan, because Kyrgyzstan is not part and parcel of the ICC. They are not. That's not a signatory country for Rome Statute, and that's one of the recommendations. What we are really saying that Kyrgyzstan should sign the Rome Statute, and that way that would be the prevented issue in terms of the future similar type of issues, and that we hope. Your last question was related to the issue that are we trusting on the juridical system in Kyrgyzstan to put people accountable, and here I can say you, as I already indicated, that principally we must trust in every country on the juridical systems practically, obviously, we have recognized several hiccups and problems, which we already indicated in our report. Even that somewhat we are feeling that, and not only feeling, but we are seeing that the juridical processes have been unbalanced, and that way that should be addressed seriously. I'm very pleased, and I note it very clearly here to you also, that President Rosa Otunbayeva has several times addressed that issue. Also, government has said that there should be reform even in terms of the judicial system in Kyrgyzstan, that it would be properly in future addressing these questions. And here actually it's one of the tasks and one of the recommendations also we have in our report. It's a task for international community to help in reforming the judicial system in Kyrgyzstan.
Dr. Kiljunen, we're joined by co-chairman of the commission, Ben Cardin, who's on a very tight schedule in the Senate, and he has some questions or some comments.
Well, Kimmo, first of all, thank you for what you've done. It's good to see you, even though it's long distance. It's nice to see.
Nice to see you also.
It looks like you're aging well. That's good. I'm sure.
See you in Belgrade, hopefully.
Good. Well, yeah, I will be in Belgrade, so I look forward to seeing you in Belgrade.
Good.
And Kyrgyzstan is a country in which the OSCE was relevant, that they really got involved, and certain issues were certainly calmed down dramatically. And I think we can take great pride that the process with OSCE had a major impact in reducing the amount of violence and death. Having said that, as your report points out, there are significant challenges that we need to understand and confront. Now, I didn't hear your original point, but looking at the focus of this hearing on the minorities, the Uzbeks, the question is whether the Uzbeks have confidence in the centralized government and whether they'll return and stay in Kyrgyzstan, whether they'll be able to economically prosper in Kyrgyzstan, whether they'll get a fair share of the governmental resources, since they are now going to have a very minority status within the government. And these are issues that are not easily resolved, but I thought that your report at least helped us to understand that better. And I hope we can continue to put a spotlight on this to make the type of progress for a representation of all people in Kyrgyzstan. And I welcome what you've done, and I can tell you we will treat your information with the greatest amount of attention.
Thanks, Ben. Good questions. You are addressing it very well, the long-term problems, minority problems in Kyrgyzstan, particularly as related to Uzbeks. One should remember that the Uzbek community in southern Kyrgyzstan were each a major community. As I said, roughly 40% of the population in Osh are Uzbek. They do actually control quite well the economy. They are, by average, they are richer than the Kyrgyz population, which is primarily from countryside dominating in the south. Uzbeks are dominating in the cities. They are more well-to-do, as I said, the Uzbek community, but very important, they are somewhat excluded from the public administration. Also from the politics of the country. Similarly, Uzbeks are not represented practically at all in law and enforcement bodies. Similarly, they are not represented in juridical systems. So that there are imbalances which are serious one in terms of creating long-term harmony in the society. Obviously, Kyrgyz population's economic living conditions should be improved, but similar way, the Uzbek population's participation in the public affairs of Kyrgyzstan should be improved in order to really reconciliate in the longer term, as I said. These are typical minority problems, as you put it very clearly, and OEC, obviously, the body where we have been, is addressing those issues. As regards to the role of OECE in southern Kyrgyzstan and in terms of our inquiry commission too, it was a bit more complicated. As you know, I was the special representative of OEC Parliamentary Assembly in the Central Asia, but OEC itself didn't actually this was independent commission from OEC, even independent commission from OEC Parliamentary Assembly. OEC was very active after the events, tragic events in southern Kyrgyzstan, in terms of trying to help to reorganize or reform the police forces southern Kyrgyzstan. That created quite strong resistance in Kyrgyzstan, and at the end compromise was found, so this certain type of technical advisory police group was sent to the southern Kyrgyzstan to help these type of reforms. So OEC is present there, obviously, trying to help also the reconciliation process, but it's a long-term and long process.
Look forward to seeing you in Belgrade.
Yeah. Thanks.
Dr. Kiljunen, I'd like to ask just a couple of very brief questions, if you would, as best you can. Provide answers, and again, I thank you for the gracious grant of your time to be here via this satellite hookup. First,
it's great pleasure for me not to travel there.
Okay.
So I can see you here in Helsinki.
Thank you. Could you just tell us about the role of the media during the violence? And we understand, I know your report recommends that the Uzbek language media be reopened as soon as possible. And yet we note that the Parliament has voted to ban Fergana RU and limit international media during the upcoming presidential election. Secondly, if you could speak to retaliation. Has there been any retaliation against any of those people with whom you had contact and your group? It's very important if you could get that on the record so we know if there has been such retaliation. And how would you characterize the reaction of President Karimov to the crisis that erupted last year? And finally, your ability to travel there obviously has been revoked. Are you seeking, if you were able to travel, would you again, hop on a plane and go there with either by yourself or with the other members of your commission? Is there unfinished business that you need to accomplish by a in-country visit?
Thanks very much. Very good questions, and even with the very detailed questions. First of the role of media. In America, I know in Finland, we know the present world today, media is a very strong player. It creates the image of the reality in every society. It influences very much in terms of formulating opinions, and that way the responsibility of the media is important. In our report, we don't have very deep analysis of the media, but what we have is very clearly indicating that media was one of those instruments somewhat polarizing and creating stigmas and creating animosities among the ethnic groups. It should have been more, let's say, reconciliatory. And that's very unfortunate. We are actually asking in the one of the recommendation is that they should create an code of conduct media in terms of ethnic balance of the society. In terms of aftermath, and now I'm telling you my own experience, and you as a politician myself too, the press conference I had in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek on 3rd of May, was an extraordinary press conference. I have never had so hostile media environment anywhere as there. Sometimes they were attacking very strongly the media representatives against me, and they were applauding to those questions that they made as if they would testify against me, not myself giving the report. So the media, unfortunately, plays in Kyrgyzstan major role, and unfortunately, even today, not necessarily helping the reconciliation. That's a severe problem and a severe issue. Then you ask about the retaliation in terms of the parliament decision concerning the people who had helped us. And here I'm open. Unfortunately, there are evidence at least one person who have helped us, Uzbek origin, has actually left Osh because of harassment related to his technical help to our commission. He has took refuge first in Bishkek, and he is now going to Kazakhstan. So that is obviously major issue. If there would be more widespread, and even this one single case is terrifying, that those people who have helped us are somewhat in jeopardy inside the country. That's a major problem in terms of the Commission's integrity and in terms of future similar type of investigation. If they're done in any part of the world, if the result is persona non grata for the heads of the Commission, no travel possibilities for the other Commission members, or even harassment against people who have worked, it's absolutely impossible to accept. Then President Karimov's role in Uzbekistan. Of course, it's a very good question and complicated question. You obviously remember Andijan 2005. There was a violent episode in Andijan, Uzbekistan, which never were investigated properly by international community. Uzbekistan government didn't allow that to take place, although request was made by different governments and different international organizations. In this case, in terms of the Kyrgyzstan 2010, now Uzbekistan government has been very supportive for international inquiry to take place in the international forums. They have requested it, and they have been different ways supportive. Even how they handled the refugee situation in South and supported the Kyrgyzstan government to balance the situation has been both agreed in terms of Kyrgyzstan itself, the government of Kyrgyzstan, as well as by international community. So in that way, President Karimov and Uzbekistan government have been very constructive. Then the last question concerning myself and my Commission members in terms of the future. Obviously, and I'm very open here, I'm very sad and sorrow that I don't have the opportunity to travel to Kyrgyzstan. I have met some deputies from Kyrgyzstan parliament here in Finland a few weeks ago. I hope I will meet them in Belgrade. And we have an open discussion and ask them openly why you made this decision. I suppose I'm one of the friends of your country, and I am friend of your country, and I wanted to help in terms of reconciliation process. Obviously, I wanted to travel there. My Commission members want to go there and help in different ways. Even if the question is about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we might give advices and ideas, etc., etc. But now, because of the ban, obviously it's impossible. As I said, the President office and the government has deplored the situation, but obviously it has a legal effect, because if Parliament makes a decision, obviously it's a Parliament decision. It's a political primarily than legal one, but it has also legal consequences, and that means that I can only contribute for Kyrgyzstan as I hope to contribute outside of Kyrgyzstan today, not inside.
Dr. Kiljunen, we're joined today by Ambassador Mukhtar Jumaliyev, who will be testifying in the second panel. And I'm just wondering, if you had a direct message that you'd like to convey to him or a question, we would appreciate it. Or if you want to think about that for a moment, we are joined by Congressman Trent Franks, who is chairman of the Judiciary's Committee on the Constitution, and an expert on the Constitution, but he also wears another hat. He's the chairman of the caucus, the House Caucus on Religious Freedom. So if you had a question for the ambassador, or I could go right to Chairman Franks.
If I can say a few words, first of Mukhtar Jumaliyev, I can say he is my friend. We know each other very well, and thanks for Mukhtar Jumaliyev. He helped very much originally when we were establishing the Commission. He gave guidances and took it very responsible way, understanding the difficult tasks for the commissions, and I'm very grateful for that one. So Mukhtar is in that way my friend, but also obviously responsible civil servant. I have obviously one question to him. In this case, I hope that he passes the message to Kyrgyzstan government that what they committed in terms of our report, saying that our recommendations are by major part valid and important, that I would like that he also confirms that one, and particularly because the idea was to establish a special national commission to look at our recommendations, how he sees the situation just now in the country in terms of establishing that special commission to look at the implementation of our recommendation and monitor. I would like very much to hear his reactions to that one.
Okay, he will be in the witness stand just a few minutes from now. I'd like to yield to Chairman Franks for any questions he might have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith. And I just say for those listening here, there is no one in the Congress of the United States that has greater credibility as it relates to religious freedom and human rights than Chairman Chris Smith. He is a hero to all of us, and we appreciate the opportunity just to sit here with you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kiljunen, I also am grateful to you for joining us. I know that there are plenty of things for a fellow like you to do, but we're grateful that you've taken the time. So I just have one question. I know you're dealing with a lot of economic challenges there in Kyrgyzstan, and I wanted to ask, related to the lack of economic opportunities as well as some of the continued harassment, really, of some of the ethnic Uzbeks, many of them have essentially left the country. And for those who stay, I'm just wondering if as an abused and disenfranchised minority population, could it create a situation where those youth of that community are vulnerable to recruitment by extremist organizations, Muslim extremism, jihadist groups? Is that a potential, or is it something that you've observed in any way?
Thanks for the question. It's a very important one, because one of the major claims before the inquiry started was that it's actually the whole tragedy was result of religious extremism and international terrorism. Our evidence, anyhow, is not actually going to that direction. We couldn't say that it's clearly somewhat organized from abroad, or let's say religious extremist groups had utilized the opportunity and created this chaos and tragedy itself. They might have played a role. We cannot never say so, but it wasn't systematic, and we couldn't get evidence on that one. How in terms of future? That was your question. Obviously, always when there is a situation that certain type of disharmony is in the society, polarized situation is in the society, obviously that's a breeding ground for any types of extremistic elements. So potentially, yes, if the reconciliation process is not properly taking place in Kyrgyzstan, southern Kyrgyzstan particularly, obviously there is a room for different types of extremism, and I hope that that's not created the situation ripe for these processes. We know very well that in Fergana Valley and in that region, Afghanistan is next door almost, there is lots of room for different types of extremistic and terroristic movements, and that's why this is even more important to address seriously. And that's why we are hoping, and I'm so pleased that the government of Kyrgyzstan is also willing, in terms of their reactions to our report, to help for the reconciliation.
Thank you, Dr. Kiljunen. Perhaps I'll just ask one more question. That'd be all right. I would just ask you finally, sir, what efforts or steps do you know that may be being taken by the Kyrgyzstan government to apply the rule of law to the entire society, whether it be religious freedom or just the general rule of law within the judicial system and other security instruments of the state? What are those steps, and can the OSCE ever be of further assistance in to that end or to that goal?
And this is a very relevant question. Particularly, you should ask Mukhtar Dubaliev also to respond to that one, because obviously he's representing the government there. I know, as I said, that already that the President herself has several times addressed that questions, hiccups and handicaps in the juridical system, And I know also that Prosecutor General's office, when we discussed there, they also recognize the problems. But unfortunately, it's a long process to reform the judicial system, and you're absolutely correct saying that maybe, if it's requested by Kyrgyzstan authorities, maybe the international community could seriously help in this area. I know that European Union, for example, has helped in Kazakhstan on giving this judicial system help, and we are also recommending in our report that the international community could in that area help Kyrgyzstan government. So I think it's a major issue you're asking.
Well, thank you again, sir, for joining us, and thank you, Chairman Smith.
Thank you very much, Chairman Franks. Dr. Kiljunen, thank you so much for, again, appearing before our commission via satellite. Your report was extraordinary. I first read about it when I was traveling, and it came across as an AP dispatch, and especially the way you were being, in my opinion, very much mistreated. So I want to thank you for staying at this, because you, like our commission and your work for years, has been very much focused on human rights. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. We'll see also you maybe in Belgrade. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. See you there. I'd like to now welcome our next panel, made up of the Ambassador Mukhtar Jumalayev, who arrived in Washington last December to represent the Kyrgyz Republic. He previously served as Kyrgyz Ambassador to Switzerland, the World Trade Organization, and the UN office in Geneva, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff to the President and First Deputy of Minister of Foreign Trade and Industry. A full bio of you, as well as our other very distinguished witnesses who will follow on panel 3, will be made a part of the record. So, Mr. Ambassador, please proceed as you would like.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening us this microphone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening us this meeting today. And this is a very important issue for Kyrgyzstan, and this is a very sensitive issue. And I think this is important for the future stability in Kyrgyzstan and for all the reconciliation process. What we are discussing today here, it's really very painful, and this is a very sad story in Kyrgyzstan's history. I was hearing all the comments done by the Kimo Kiljunen, and of course, it seems to me that the report itself, and we have already commented and expressed by the government on the comment by, first of all, accepting all the comments done by the Commission. And Mr. Chairman, it was the first time experiencing when Kyrgyzstan made access for the international investigations into its territory, and such a precedent never happened in the post-Soviet countries. The government of Kyrgyzstan appreciates importance and value of work done by the International Inquiry Commission, and also its press is thanked to the reputable members for the efforts of contribution devoted to investigate the tragic events that occurred in Kyrgyzstan. The government also agrees with a number of conclusions and criticism contained in the report, and it does not absolve the responsibility for what happened. The provisional government honestly and openly acknowledged its guilt and responsibility on its address on June 16, 2010 to the people of Kyrgyzstan and the international community. Kyrgyzstan's government is taking and will continue to take all necessary measures to eliminate or minimize the consequences of the tragic conflicts and to prevent the repetition of similar events in the future. Many of the recommendations contained in the report have been implemented by the government from the day of the conflict and from which was localized. Kyrgyzstan's government will establish the special commission to implement and monitor implementation of the recommendations of the report and other reports and researches related to the tragic events of 2010 in the southern Kyrgyzstan. However, the Kyrgyz government believes that does not contain sufficient evidence to conclude that there have been made certain acts that can qualify it as a crime against humanity during the June events in the city of Osh. Kyrgyz government considers unacceptable the visible tendency in the ICC report to take into account to a greater extent the crimes committed only by the members of one ethnic group while ignoring the deaths of the casualties suffered by the same group and depicting another groups as the single suffered and defenseless party. It is also important to take into account the fact that during the conflict there were no sufficient political, financial and law enforcement resources at the disposal of the provisional government to counter the large-scale provocations of the interethnic clashes. However, even under such conditions, the people and the authorities of Kyrgyzstan independently and without outside intervention managed to stop violence and localize the conflict within few days. Kyrgyzstan's government took a great effort to reconcile the parties of the conflict, to overcome the consequences of the conflict and still proceeds with this. However, there is still tangible tensions and a number of unsolved social-economic problems in the conflict zone. In conditions of the started presidential campaign, some of the conclusions of the report can be used by the opponents of the democratic reforms to destabilize the situation and strengthen the position of the internal revanchist forces. Kyrgyzstan's government hopes that necessary conclusions from the events of 2010 will be made by the international community as well, including those organizations that pursue the aim to preventing and neutralizing the eliminating consequences of such conflicts. We have also started work on developing and implementing the concept of ethnic development and consolidation of the people of Kyrgyzstan. We are doing everything possible to punish all those responsible. All trials are held in conditions of unprecedented openness. But the situation remains difficult, in particular with concerns about the emotional nature of the trials of the resonant crimes. The new government declared its uncompromising war against criminals and determined to stop the merging criminal gangs with the authorities. The government has taken urgent measures to normalize functioning of law enforcement and security agencies. The Defense Council was established as a coordinating and supervisory body. In order to effectively combat drug trafficking, and drug control agency abolished by the previous government has been restored. We intended to do everything possible to create conditions to strengthen the rule of law, a culture of political dialogue, and open the equitable society. Within short period of time, we have achieved some qualitative improvements. Independent media is functioning. The opposition has not only ample opportunity to criticize the head of the state, but the ruling parliamentary coalition, but also actually participates in the governing the country by leading 3 parliamentary committees on budget and finance, law enforcement and the rule of law, human rights and public organizations. There are supervisory boards established in the ministries to ensure transparency and accountability of the government to the people. We are reforming the judicial system to make it truly independent and introduce mechanisms to ensure quality selections of judges through the council, whose composition is formed with the participation of opposition representatives. Mr. Chairman, that many people want to ask today me on the Parliament's decision with regard to the Kimmo Kilunen's report. And as you know, after the report was released, the situation in the country became more tense. The people of Kyrgyzstan were expecting that the report will be objective, balanced, and will contribute for the reconciliation, and we still believe on it. In such a situation, while Parliament agreed with the comments of the government, but it passed an order to the responsible agency to take a decision on the entering of Mr. Kimmo Kiljunen to the Kyrgyz Republic. In this regard, the only specialized agencies should decide on this issue. At the same time, the President of Kyrgyz Republic called Parliament of the Kyrgyz Republic to reconsider its decision at the meeting of the People's Assembly yesterday. The President called the Parliament to pay more attention on adoption of the recommendations. Since the government comments to the report are complementary document, the report of the Commission, we believe that the report...
Ambassador Chumalayev, you're at a very critical point in your testimony, and I am loath to interrupt you. Just hold on for 1 second. I have 2 minutes to report to the floor for a vote. There are 3 votes. I will be back within 10 to 15 minutes at the most. So the Commission will stand in brief recess, and if you could then get right back to where you are, because it is a very critical part of your testimony. So we stand in recess for 15 minutes. The Commission will resume its hearing, and again, Mr. Ambassador, I apologize for that delay. We had 3 votes. Nothing I could do about it, but I would now yield to you. Please continue with your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I was just completing my statement by saying by informing you about the decision of the Parliament on using ban for the Kimmo Kiljunen's entry to the Parliament. So that was my final remarks, which I just informed you that the President called also for the Parliament to reconsider its decision, and it was done yesterday. But at the same time, we also know that the Parliament has accepted the recommendations, the comments of the government, which actually accepts the recommendations of the Commission. So, therefore, what Kimmo Kiljunen says today, that asking me to respond to whether Kyrgyz government will establish the Commission for the implementation of the Commission's report. Of course, there is a will. There will be established the special commission to bring together not only the report of the International Inquiry Commission, but there is also number of reports, which is 5 or 6 reports has been produced after the violence, and then the Commission should work out all these reports and to establish the action plan for the implementation of all these Commission's recommendations. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much, and thank you for that encouraging news. I'm sure Kimmo will be was very happy to hear that as well. Just let me ask you a few questions. Can you tell us the main components of your government's new national plan to promote inter-ethnic harmony, and how will that be implemented? And if you could also speak to the credible allegations of torture, rape, mistreatment in detention, especially rape and torture. Are those allegations being investigated, and by whom? And are people being held accountable? Are there any instances where someone who has abused in recent weeks, months, days of being himself arrested and held for those crimes?
I think the main priority for the government is, of course, the plans for the reconciliation process. This is the priority number 1 for the government, and we see that this should be the priority also not only for the government but for all the society. Just after the government started to develop the strategy on interethnic development. And I believe that, and it is, we know that all the ethnic minorities and civil society has participated in the development of this strategic document, which will be, or which is already presented to the public yesterday. I think this document should be presented yesterday, and I think if this document will be adopted, so there is action plan for the interethnic development, which includes all the interests of ethnic minorities there. And this is the actual action plan which we believe will be adopted in few days, maybe these days, where the Assembly of Peoples of Kyrgyzstan is gathering together to see these documents and to discuss the plans. With regard to the cases and violations, rapes and tortures, of course, this happened, and nobody can deny about that. And we have almost more than 5,000 cases, and Kimo Kilunian also informed about these cases. And of course, it's a huge cases, 5,000. The main purpose for this, of course, for us, it is to provide open, transparent, and fair, objective judicial process for all these cases. And the president of the Kyrgyz Republic and the government is putting all the efforts in order to, and we understand that only the fair, objective consideration and fair, objective process can help for the reconciliations, and we do all our efforts for the reforms in the judicial system. At the same time, we also work hard in order to reform our law enforcement system. We're also working hard in order to see what was recommended by the Kilunian's report, that he was saying that there was a lack of representation of other ethnic group in the judicial system, in the law enforcement system. So all these gaps will be taken into account, and we are in the process of this reform.
Let me ask you, if I could, do you believe that the political will is there to empower sufficient numbers of prosecutors to collect evidence? And you know, time is no friend of any prosecution, and if time is allowed to elapse, I would be concerned, I think we all would be concerned, that memories might fade, even though this is very recent, particularly for the people who have been tortured or raped or both in prison. I mean, it seems to me that, is this something, if you could answer that, but also, is this something that's going on real time, right now? Or can you assure us that the security apparatus, the police service, is not engaging in these kinds of abuses, like right now, today?
Thank you for this question. So it's, I cannot say that we still have such a situation right now. That was happened before, and we have 5,000 cases which happened on this, what you just mentioned. I think it is clear that security forces and the law enforcement bodies is taking under control of the situation in the south, and we say that we are localized this situation just in very few days. But of course, that was the violations was. We see the reports by the NGOs that there were some cases also, which was the continuing the violation in the process. But every case is under the control of the law enforcement representatives there. And there was also mentioned that the OSCE representatives also, the consultants is there in order to assist our law enforcement representatives to proceed how to deal with such a difficult situation which we faced first time in the south of the region. And I would definitely say that right now there is no such a situation which you are worrying about that. Thank you.
My understanding is that there are at least some people in the political parties calling the OSCE Community Security Initiative the small number of trainers who are unarmed that have been deployed there. Matter of fact, an original call for 50 such unarmed OSCE trainers was rejected. They're calling it an occupation force. And I'm wondering, you know, it would seem to me that right now, Kyrgyzstan needs more, not less, such trainers to have a presence there, particularly when it comes to training police on basic human rights norms. What's your thought about the Community Service Initiative? Do you welcome it? Does your government welcome it? And more importantly, do you think it should be expanded?
Mr. Chairman, of course, this was a very sensitive issue. Even we started taking decision to get the OSCE police contingent to Kyrgyzstan, and at the same time, it was even very difficult to get the Kimo Kilyunen's commission to Kyrgyzstan. But there was a political will that we should do it, and we should decide that we need to make open, transparent investigation process for all this situation. And with regard to the OSCE, it was also the strong resistance from the public society that we cannot allow to get to bring the internal police in Kyrgyzstan, that they will investigate all the process. There was the misunderstanding about the OSCE presence in Kyrgyzstan. And I think the government, after the consultations, after the government provides more information to the public society, so finally we also find such a formula which is acceptable both for the OSCE and for Kyrgyzstan, that we, at this stage, after the conflict was localized, we invited the consultants, not the police, because of course the public was strongly opposed getting in the police into the territory of Kyrgyzstan.
What protections does someone have, particularly in detention, not necessarily when they're finally incarcerated, but while they're still being interrogated, that would prevent or inhibit torture being imposed upon them? And has the Red Crescent or the International Committee for the Red Cross or any other body like it, but especially either of those two, been allowed unfettered access into the prisons and into pretrial detention?
At that time, I was actually in Kyrgyzstan, and we also appreciate the Red Cross efforts, which actually works strongly to provide any kind of assistance for the detention places. And I think we should continue to cooperate with Red Cross and Crescent in order to in this sector. I think in this issue, I think this is important, and we do appreciate that they have good expertise and good practices to deal with such an issue in such a situations.
And as you know, they report only to you. So, I mean, our hope is, and let me add our Commission's voice, and in asking that your government robustly get them into the scene. It does have a chilling effect, if you will, on certain police misconduct if there is a ever-increasing presence of those internationally credible international experts who really know how to, I mean, they don't care what government they go to, and they'll do it here in the United States, as you know, as they did in Guantanamo. It's important that they have unfettered access. So I just want to add our voice to that plea that you do more to get them into the country. Okay. Let me ask you, there are a number of recent reports in the media that cite a steady exodus of Uzbeks and other minorities from Kyrgyzstan as a result of the ongoing harassment, attacks, and threats of violence, and the loss of properties. What is the government doing to prevent that exodus, and who are acquiring those properties when they are confiscated?
All these cases, Mr. Chairman, under the investigation now, under the investigation process. And for me, from here it's very difficult who they are. And of course, this is our Kyrgyz citizens, first of all, who are involved in all these crimes. And the government is taking all the efforts in order to make the open, fair, transparent process of investigations and to prevent further on these difficult issues you mentioned. But before the court will conclude, it's very difficult to say that differentiate whether it is which ethnic groups are involved in this process. But this is first of all, the criminal cases. We accept that this is the criminal cases under the investigation process, and we will do our best to punish for all those who are involved in these crimes.
I'm sorry. One final question, and I asked this of Kimmo, if he knew anything about this. I'll never forget, in the 1980s, I joined Amanda Valladares, who spent almost 2 decades in Fidel Castro's gulags, was tortured without mercy, and actually wrote a book called Against All Hope, chronicling his 2 decades of resistance inside the gulag. He led the effort at the Human Rights Commission, and I was with him in the late 1980s when he got the UN to do a fact-finding mission to Cuba, and they were told they would have unfettered access to people, there would be no retaliation, and almost everyone who spoke to the UN investigators were retaliated against. Now, Kimmo has been to Kyrgyzstan. They have interviewed people. They have spoken to large numbers of people. Other investigators surely will be doing the same as time goes forward, including indigenous people from your country. What kind of protections do people have who come forward with information or already have from when they are on board a plane, if they're internationals, so that the retaliation is not imposed upon them in beatings and other misfortunes come their way? Do you have anything in place to ensure no retaliation?
Of course, this is very important. Yeah. That we would avoid the retaliation after the report has been published, and the government has taken all the efforts in order to prevent any kind of provocation or repetition of such a situation after the reports has been released. And we were waiting actually, and it was very difficult that time we commemorated the 1-year anniversary just recently, and I think that the God bless us that we will pass through a very difficult time of period for us, and the government is doing all the efforts in order to prevent. With regard to the human rights, with the UNHCR commissions, that we are also cooperating with the international experts there. And just a few days ago, there was the resolution taken on Kyrgyzstan for technical assistance in Kyrgyzstan. And these issues also will be covered under the technical assistance efforts of the international community. Just after the situation happened, the interethnic violence happened in Kyrgyzstan, that was the first resolution under the UN High Commissioner Commission to call the international community to help Kyrgyzstan in preventing or in repetition of such a situation. And we are very grateful that the international community expressed its support for Kyrgyzstan, and we are open also for cooperate with them, because we also feel that we have lack of experience in such a situation, and we also think that international community also should act, and this will be also lesson for international community that we were not able to avoid such a situation in advance, that we faced this after the June events.
Kimmo would like, I'm sure, to travel back to Kyrgyzstan. He's denied access or entry. I hope that will be revisited. And an analyst for the International Crisis Group would also like to visit, and that person has been denied a visa. It's something you could look into as to why. I mean, the ICG on a number of countries has provided very useful insights and very fine recommendations to countries that are experiencing crisis, and yet their analysts can't even get into the country. Do you know why they were denied that visa, that person?
Mr. Chairman, I just talked to the representative of ICG and requesting this, issue, I have to find why the visa was not still issued. And I think there's, I don't know, actually, this is my first time when I heard that she was not able to get visa from our embassy, but I will check it out. And of course, I think there should be no reason. With regard to the chemo, I told you that the president doing steps further in order to recall the parliament to reconsider its decision.
Thank you. And I'll only conclude by two things. First, thank you so much for making yourself available to come into a congressional hearing of this kind, a Helsinki Commission hearing, for your answers, which I believe are very candid, and I thank you for that, and for your willingness to work with our commission going forward, especially on a number of these items that could be very quickly addressed. And above all, I would ask that those who have committed crimes, that there is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity or any other serious capital crime, and I would hope that those who have committed these crimes will themselves face long jail sentences after going through a fair and balanced prosecution. So please, I mean, it's very important at the end of this that it's not glossed over and somehow, in a spirit of reconciliation, those who commit crimes don't do time. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to now introduce our third panel, and beginning with Dr. Martha Alcott, a senior associate with the Russian and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment here in Washington. Dr. Alcott specializes in the problems of transitions in Central Asia and the Caucasus, as well as the security challenges in the Caspian region more generally. Dr. Alcott has testified before the Commission before, so we welcome her back. Then we'll hear from Dr. Alishir Kamidov, professor lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Kamidov began his career as director of the Osh Media Resource Center, a nonprofit independent media association in southern Kyrgyzstan. He later worked at Notre Dame University's Sanctions and Security Project, the NEH Summer Institute, and on Eurasian Civilizations at Harvard, and at the Foreign Policy Studies program of the Brookings Institution. He was in Osh during the June 10th violence, so we look forward to his firsthand account and any suggestions that he might have for our commission on how we should proceed, as well as the country of Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked to testify before you today. I'd like to focus my comments, which I'm just going to share the highlights of and submitted a written testimony. I'd like to focus my comments on the reaction to the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, the reaction that it evoked in Kyrgyzstan, and what may be the implications of this reaction for future political, social, and ethnic developments in the country. I've not traveled to southern Kyrgyzstan since the June violence. I've made 6 trips to Kyrgyzstan over the past 18 months, and I happened to be in Kyrgyzstan shortly after the report was published and got to interview many of the people. I got to talk with people at various levels of society and government about it. I think before I go further in my comments, I really want to commend the stellar team that prepared the report. They put in extraordinary effort in what was a tremendously difficult endeavor and came up with a detailed account of terrible acts that destroyed so many lives and made many, many very useful recommendations. The end product will serve as a lasting indictment of what went wrong in the southern part of Kyrgyzstan last June. The recommendations they offer reflect much thought and discussion and have provided President, the government, and Parliament with a great deal to think about. And as has been noted here today, many of them are already under serious discussions. I do think, as we go forward, the government of Kyrgyzstan deserves credit for creating the conditions necessary for the inquiry to go forward. It really was the first of its kind in the region. I would make one criticism of the report, and this is really what I'm going to focus some of my testimony on, the reaction. The only criticism I would make of the report is that its findings and recommendations were not presented in a way that was designed to make them palatable for the Kyrgyz polity. I'm not speaking of the findings themselves, but the question of audience in the report was the Western audience that had really, and the international audience that had really sent them. And because of it, this very strong reaction, and the people in Kyrgyzstan compare this report to their own homegrown efforts to investigate what occurred. This very strong homegrown action I fear, will increase the difficulty of implementing some of the very important recommendations that the Commission has offered. The fact that there's been such a loud outcry against some of its recommendations, especially, and I'll come back to this, the fact that in the first paragraph of the recommendations they urge that the name of the country be changed. The fact that there's been such a loud outcry, including the deplorable statement that Kimmo Kiljunen is persona non grata, I think demonstrates the amount of political grandstanding going on in Kyrgyzstan today, but it also points up the sharp division of power that we have in Kyrgyzstan. We've heard today from a representative of the government. Power is really divided right now between a president who, since the June referendum, has very little power, actually, and what she exercises with enormous political skill, with a government which has a great deal of power, and reports to a parliament which has no experience in supervising executive power. And this is the atmosphere in which these recommendations are moving forward. I think that the majority of Kyrgyz citizens would not take exception to the vast majority of recommendations of the report, especially those that deal with public safety and security. And most would probably even support the majority of recommendations on accountability and on the need for criminal and disciplinary accountability, although they would probably counsel you with a quasi-fatalistic mode that it may take longer to get these changes implemented than one would like, having been experienced in Kyrgyzstan. What I think most ordinary Kyrgyz citizens and political figures find difficult to accept is the idea that Kyrgyzstan may have been more morally culpable that ethnic Kyrgyz may have been more morally culpable than ethnic Uzbeks in the events of June. And this being pushed in their face by this report is the thing I think that they find it really, really difficult to accept, which is one of the reasons why the kinds of confidence building and reconciliation that the Commission is talking about and that the President and the government have made supporting gestures towards is so critical. For most ethnic Kyrgyz, I think it is important to them that the violence lasted only a few days and that it didn't turn into a civil war, and that they try to take personal and emotional satisfaction in, rather than focus on the questions of responsibility that the report made so clear. To me, the most controversial recommendations of the Commission from the point of view of the Kyrgyz polity, and here I include ethnic minorities of Kyrgyzstan and not just ethnic Kyrgyz, save the Uzbeks, is the idea that the country should be renamed, or that there should be a special status granted to the Uzbek language, a constitutional status. This is very, very controversial, and it is not something that is widely supported outside of the Uzbek community. I'm going to just switch the conclusion. We've been here really a long time, and everything is in the testimony itself. I think it's important as we go forward for us to remember that the country is as a whole experiencing a trauma, the trauma that brought down the Bakiyev government, and living in this state of incomplete political resolution with an interim president, a very new parliamentary system that's not supported, if public opinion polls are to be believed, by the majority of the population. And on top of it, this trauma in southern Kyrgyzstan. The trauma that's experienced is experienced differently by those people who are in southern Kyrgyzstan and those people who are living outside of southern Kyrgyzstan. But all groups feel traumatized and all groups feel aggrieved. It's in this environment that the recommendations go forward. And it's in this environment that it will become, that the recommendations will be considered. Let me just go to the very last conclusion of my testimony. I think it's really critical that the government and the parliament and the president all be pressured to try to move towards the kinds of efforts at reconciliation, many of which are in the report. But how should the Helsinki Commission itself respond? While defending human rights, I believe that it's important that the Helsinki Commission continue to be what you have been for decades now, strongly defending the human rights of the entire population of a country, regardless of their ethnic origin. But I do not believe that the Helsinki Commission should, as the Independent Investigative Commission did at one point, cross the line and become prescriptive about other aspects of nation building. The lives of ethnic minorities everywhere were disrupted when the USSR fell apart, and their situation is particularly sad where people live in communities that their ancestors lived in for generations and now find themselves as minorities. The violence of June 2010 is a tragedy, and the victims of violence and their survivors should be compensated, while those responsible should be held accountable. But the shift away from Uzbek language education is not a tragedy, nor is the failure to rebuild Soviet cultural institutions in southern Kyrgyzstan. In my opinion, it dilutes the power of the human rights message when outsiders seek to engage in that degree of nation building, even when they do so with the best of intentions. The political freedom of all citizens of Kyrgyzstan should be defended equally. Freedom of press, religion, assembly, evenly applied, and the government of Kyrgyzstan should continue to be pressed to ensure that legal safeguards are put in place to guarantee that local security and judicial officials apply the law evenly, regardless of the ethnicity of the accused, or are held accountable for their actions. But it is my opinion that we cannot even the playing field between ethnic Kyrgyz and the various ethnic minorities of the countries. And those international agencies and actors that seek to do so risk losing their credibility with the Kyrgyz polity and the Kyrgyz elite. The Kyrgyz language is going to dominate in Kyrgyzstan, and those who can't speak it, and actually most ethnic Uzbeks can, and those who can't speak it will have a harder time in public life. That is the pattern everywhere in the Central Asian region, and will be the case in Kyrgyzstan as well. The ethnic Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan face a difficult set of choices in coming years. Adapt to the changing political realities in Kyrgyzstan, and this doesn't mean they shouldn't be introduced, there shouldn't be affirmative action pressures to make sure they're introduced in sectors in society where they're underrepresented, or think about relocating. These choices are not of their making, but I do not think that international actors can do much more than press the Kyrgyz government to respect the basic human rights of all their citizens. To take this more limited approach may make us more effective in trying to ensure that peace prevails in southern Kyrgyzstan, but there will be no guarantees. And to not take this approach, to not focus on human rights in its purest definition, is to risk that the most important recommendations of the Kalunin Commission don't get the fair hearing in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you very much. Please.
Yeah.
Dr. Gamidov.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for having me here to address the important question of ethnic tensions in my native country, Kyrgyzstan. In June 2010, I was among those Kyrgyz citizens of Uzbek origin who fled to the Uzbek-Kyrgyz border trying to flee the violence. Just like many other Kyrgyz citizens, I cherished hopes that Russia, Kazakhstan, and other countries with which Kyrgyzstan has partnership relations would intervene to stop the violence. Our hopes were dashed when Kyrgyzstan was told by the Collective Security Treaty Organization uniting these countries that it has to deal with the conflict on its own. And so suddenly a country where interests of many countries overlapped became no one's backyard. There are many explanations for what happened in South Kyrgyzstan. There's historical explanation saying that these two communities, they hated each other for centuries. There are economic explanations pointing to economic disparities between the two groups. And there are other explanations. But really, the debate about causes of the conflict misses an important issue. I would argue that to understand last year's violence, we need to have a more nuanced and holistic view of Kyrgyzstan's past and present. The violent regime change and the bloody interethnic clash in 2010 are actually symptoms of a set of broader and long-standing challenges or I would call chronic ailments, that have afflicted Kyrgyzstan and other Central Asian republics, including Russia, since independence. If these ailments are not treated properly and adequately, turmoil will continue in Kyrgyzstan. Let me briefly outline what are these ailments. 20 years ago, when Kyrgyzstan became independent, it faced 4 key challenges or ailments. One was dealing with the country's political institutions. Should we preserve Soviet-era political institutions, or should we build a really democratic state? The second challenge was that of the country's identity. Do we want to build a country which will be a home for all ethnic groups, or do we want to create a country which would be run by one ethnic group? The third challenge related to the country's economy. Should we preserve the country's Soviet-era system with its social perks, or should we create a country which will be driven by market reforms? And the final challenge was related to foreign policy. Kyrgyzstan was a small country, it never was independent, and now it had to deal with enormous issues of foreign policy. So the real challenge was, do we want to build an independent foreign policy course, or should we stick to Russia? So those were the challenges. 20 years later, after 2 bloody ethnic conflicts, 2 bloody revolutions, Kyrgyzstan has made full circle, and we're back at square one. We're still dealing with the same challenges. I'd like to basically address 2 questions here. Why there has been no progress? And the second, where might things end? To understand these, to answer these questions, it's important to look at the country's history. Now, there are various explanations to the question of why there has been no progress. Some emphasize the country's history again, saying that it's the nomadic past and it's the Soviet illiberal past that has made the country more vulnerable to authoritarianism and political volatility. And then there are those who say that, look, Kyrgyzstan is in a bad authoritarian neighborhood. How can a democracy or any system develop there? And then there are those who emphasize economic factors. They say that, look, the country is lacking natural resources, just like unlike its neighbors, it does not have resources, so it's hard for its elites to create a very robust system. I would say that the main problem of Kyrgyzstan, actually, has not been lack of resources or other issues. I would say that I emphasize the role of leadership or lack of it as the major source of Kyrgyzstan's troubles. The major flaw of the Kyrgyz leaders was that they failed to find lasting solutions or effective treatments for the 4 key ailments or challenges outlined above. To be more precise, Kyrgyz leaders have continuously undermined stability by engaging in systematic alteration of political rules and arrangements whenever such rules did not suit their immediate political preferences. More importantly, Kyrgyz leaders failed to realize their historic roles as the founding fathers of the new nation and the responsibility that flows from such realization. Briefly, President Askar Akayev, let me elaborate just a little bit more. President Askar Akayev, he was Thomas Jefferson of Central Asia. He liberalized the country. He also ushered in economic reforms, but only to change his course in the early 2000s when the US base, after the US base was established. This turnaround on his own policies helped to undermine his own rule. People revolted against President Akayev. The president who came after him, instead of learning the lessons of his predecessor, he continued this authoritarian course. Rather than dealing with various political groups and community members, and rather than dealing with these 4 key challenges, he basically resorted to creating a very authoritarian regime. So, I would say that in March 2005, it was an alliance of the wealthy and the poor that toppled an authoritarian regime. In April 2010, it was a combination of economic sanctions from Russia and protests by poor and unemployed residents in such northern towns as Naryn and Talas. All this shows that President Bakiyev, he failed to really create a debate or lead the country to really resolve those 4 key ailments or challenges. People who came after him, the provisional government, were not prepared to assume power. Lacking broad legitimacy and being driven by the survival instinct, the new authorities engaged in chaotic and populist measures, such as reversal of punitive utility tariffs imposed by the previous regime, and so forth. But although they realized the need to address long-standing transitional dilemmas, they lacked resources and the strategic direction. They got their sequencing wrong in terms of dealing with the four challenges I mentioned. Despite various signals in April that ethnic tension was really palpable, authorities focused on the division of political power in Bishkek. So as a result, when the ethnic conflict erupted in Osh, they were not prepared. They lacked control over government security services, let alone rampaging crowds. So where might things end? I would say that new leaders have made attempts to resolve these long-standing dilemmas, transition dilemmas, but these efforts have been half-hearted and ineffective. Let me describe why. The first challenge, the division of powers. The parliament, the parliamentary system is not supported by a lot of people. According to recent polls, the majority of Kyrgyz citizens want to resort back to a presidential system akin to Russia. Decision makers in Russia are opposing this parliamentary system. They have been critical of it. Some influential politicians in the parliament, they want to change the constitution again. The second challenge, forming a national identity, they're not doing much actually. There is this assumption in Kyrgyzstan that, look, the Osh events have resolved this identity crisis or challenge by establishing the preeminence of the ethnic Kyrgyz and relegating ethnic minorities to secondary status positions. This view is supported by ethnic Uzbeks and Kyrgyz. As one ethnic Uzbek told me, look, Uzbeks lost, the Kyrgyz won, now we're secondary, and there will be less conflicts. The government is not challenging this erroneous assumption. It's basically living with the status quo. And this is really promoting all these nationalistic and chauvinistic forces and aggravating tensions. And rather than deal with the conflict in a rather effective way, they are basically adopting the Soviet-style tactic of sweeping the unpleasant events under the rug and putting forward a mantra of friendship of peoples. This strategy is flawed, and it resembles the one adopted by Kyrgyz authorities after the June 1990 violence. So they're also not addressing the third challenge, which is economy, rather than really promote a debate which would discuss this long-term problem. They are again engaging in populist measures by increasing public spending, salaries, and continuing with these expensive construction projects. Finally, Kyrgyz authorities are again following the footsteps of their predecessors in terms of indeterminate foreign policy. Their relations with their neighbors are really bad. Uzbekistan is really pissed off or is angry, livid about the way Kyrgyz authorities dealt with the whole crisis. The Uzbeks are concerned that the revolution will continue. Kazakhs are also unhappy with instability. Tajiks are also angry. More importantly, Russians, Moscow is unhappy about Kyrgyzstan's choice of policy, and attacks against Russian businesses are not helping Kyrgyzstan's image in Russia. And the Western partners are also becoming suspicious of all these talks in Bishkek about changing the system again. Finally, Kyrgyzstan finds itself at a crossroad. And so the Kyrgyz, the Osh events, they took their toll, but they provide a window of opportunity to finally tackle all these four transition challenges. If the Kyrgyz citizens will have this painful but important debate about how to solve these challenges, and if this process will include all citizens, Kyrgyzstanis will have, I would say, a chance to become a real model for Central Asia. If they will fail, Kyrgyzstan is set to continue with its revolutionary and painful ethnic conflict course. Thank you.
Dr. Karimov, thank you very much for your testimony, and both Dr. Olcott, thank you for your patience too, because I know this has been a long day. But frankly, the more we build this record and we're able to then act upon it, and you provide incisive insights for us to act upon. So I thank you for your written statements, your oral statements, which were extraordinary. Let me just ask a couple of questions, and then we'll conclude the hearing. How would both of you, or either of you, whoever wants to address this, assess U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan, and especially what happened June last year? Have we responded well, robustly? Have we been asleep at the switch? How would you? And secondly, on the issue of aid to southern Kyrgyzstan, is reconstruction aid flowing there? How much of it's coming from the U.S.? If you could answer those
Yes, thank you, Martha. U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan after the violent events. I must tell you, Mr. Chairman, that the United States has shown genuine interest in Kyrgyzstan, its problems. And I think the people of Kyrgyzstan, they realize it. The United States, among the first, condemned violence and called for peace and took measures to stop it. But there are also some problems with the U.S. policy. In the perceptions of many Kyrgyzstanis, the U.S. policy is not principled. There is this U.S. base, and then there are human rights, and the U.S. policy shifts between these two issues. More importantly, I would say that the Kyrgyzstanis have this perceptions of themselves as exceptional in the region because they were the first to democratize. And so they think that they are the darling of the United States and other Western countries. And this is the message that the U.S. administration, namely the Barack Obama administration, has fostered by telling the Kyrgyz that, look, you are a model again, now you will be a model for the Middle East. These kind of reassurances are useful, but they also they mislead Kyrgyz citizens. So I would say that the U.S. policy has its flaws and its positive aspects. In terms of reconstruction efforts, I would tell you that a lot of donors have adopted this policy of wait and see. They're concerned. They're not sure that the money that they will allocate to Kyrgyzstan and its regions will be spent properly. There are concerns of transparency, mismanagement, corruption. But they are ready to issue money. The World Bank, the U.S. government, World Bank announced that it's ready to approve a $70 million loan in reconstruction of various projects.
If you could, before the shifting between the base and human rights, have we had a consistent policy about torture and rape in the prisons and pre-detention?
The United States has systematically criticized failures in areas which you mentioned.
Thank
you. In terms of U.S. policy, I think I'm not as sure as you that, I mean, I know we've had a systematic policy of criticizing rape and torture, but I think abuse in the prison systems in Central Asia is not new. It came to the forefront here because the argument was it was being, I hate to be so brutally blunt, inequitably applied, that one group was being brutalized more than another group, that Uzbeks were being disproportionately arrested and they were being brutalized. But I think that it would be a real mistake to see the Kyrgyz system as gentle to Kyrgyz. It has been a brutal judicial system. There have been efforts made to reform it. There have been periods in which reform went faster than others, and I think the ambassador's plea for more assistance in this area, I think U.S. assistance, there would be a capacity to soak up more democracy assistance in the area of judicial reform and security system reform than is likely to be on offer. And I think that this is really an important focus that you raise. There's a difference between U.S. policy and the ability of the U.S. to deliver large amounts of aid on projects that we all recognize as good projects. As you know better than I, there are lots of competing demands on every tax dollar today. And by comparison, the amount of money being spent in Central Asia is very, very small. And on top of the traditional difficulties of delivering anything other than humanitarian assistance rapidly, what you had aggravating the situation in Kyrgyzstan was the fact that you didn't have a legitimate government for so long. So you went months until you had the elections. Until the last set of the October elections were completed, there wasn't really a government that was that had the credentials to negotiate many of the larger international financial loan agreements. So there has been a slower process than people in country would like to see. That's not necessarily a criticism of us. The last point I would make, though, is that one thing I think that the Kyrgyz desperately need as they go into this election period is a greater sense of awareness of what the economic realities that the country faces are. Part of the victory of populism is that no one is really forced to be realistic in their political rhetoric. They promise. There's one person who's talking about running for president who's talked about raising the GDP to roughly $9,000 a year, like a fourfold increase in a 5-year period. It's impossible. But people can take these propositions as serious ones. So in addition to talking about interethnic accord, I think if we want democracy to succeed in Kyrgyzstan, we really have to talk about empowering an electorate and a political elite at the lower levels of that elite with more knowledge, with working towards increasing the level and quality of political debate. One last comment about U.S. policy. I don't know that we were asleep at the switch, but the fact that we went through a period where we changed ambassadors, we had a period in which there was an ambassador at the end of the term, her term, who was not, in my opinion, and it's not my place to say, but was not viewed in the polity as being terribly effective. And then until we got the new person out there, named and out there, that whole process took months and months. I mean, the new ambassador's been out there just under a month, so I don't think we're asleep at the switch. But I do think that there are periods where we could have been more effective. Finally, I think it's going to be a challenge for the U.S. as Kyrgyzstan moves, if they hold presidential elections as scheduled, if they keep this timetable and don't experiment again with changing it. This policy has been very much tied at the public level to Rosa Otunbayeva as president. It's a weak presidency. She's, as I said, she's using power very, very effectively, but she doesn't have very much power. If the U.S. I think the U.S. policy has to be a policy that interacts equally with all levels of the political establishment. Where power is, we should be interacting directly. That means with the Prime Minister's office and the government and the parliament, where even if we don't like some of the things they do and we find them politically inexperienced, we really have to get our message across to all these different people and find ways to interact, because we run the risk when President Otunbayeva's term ends and a new person replaces her, that we will be so identified with the current president and the issues of the base that we will not have the kinds of levers to make a quick adjustment to be effective in the country.
Thank you. The upcoming elections, your take on, will these likely be positive? How will the tragedies of June play in those elections, the campaigns? And, given the people that are running, what happens after post-election vis-a-vis this terrible tragedy? Dr. Gamindov.
Mr. Chairman, Kyrgyzstani political actors are basically divided into two camps. There are northern politicians, and then there are southern politicians. Most of the southern politicians, they maintain close ties with the regime of the former president, whereas a lot of northern politicians were in the opposition. So really the fight or the struggle is between these two camps of politicians. There is this acting Prime Minister, Mr. Atambayev Almazbek. He's slated to run for presidency. And on the other side, in the southern camp, there are also 2 or 3 candidates. But the problem is that Mr. Kilunen's report, as well as other issues, have become caught up in this struggle between these two camps. It's not only Kimmo Kilunen's report, but also broader issues, the ones that I mentioned, the fourfold challenges, the economy, all of these are becoming problematic. And I must tell you that many Kyrgyz citizens, they are very much driven by this desire to have a strong leadership. And whoever is going to project himself or herself, that person will get votes. There are also forces who want the current president to stay because they're afraid that the struggle between the southern and northern camps may become fatal. We're talking about intra-Kyrgyz conflict. And so there are calls for Otunbayev to stay for 1 more year.
I agree. I wouldn't bet my pension on the fact that there'll be an election in the fall. I think, and I'm not predicting revolution, I think the situation, even in the South, is pretty stable right now. People want quiet if they can get it, which is one of the things that are pushing the idea that people are beginning to float that maybe they should wait a year for an election. There's also the question of changing the form of government. I think, in my opinion, as soon as there is presidential elections, there will be a serious call for constitutional reform. that will leave a stronger presidency, a weaker parliament, but still some form of power sharing, that I think there's enough support for some form of parliamentary power. But I think it's very difficult to, predict whether there won't be popular elite pressure as well as popular pressure for Rosa Otunbayeva to stay, even though she's made it clear that's not her intent, that she sees herself as a transitional figure, just stay for another year or 2 years, whatever the agreement is. And that part of that would be that there is a discussion of constitutional reform again. There's a big discussion now, do they have the money for an election? Ms. Otunbayeva said yesterday or today that there'll be new candidates coming out. I think that everybody in the elite would feel more comfortable moving towards a presidential election if there was some sort of consensus around a candidate even in advance, and the belief that the election itself wouldn't serve to tear the country apart. And right now there's no consensus. There are several figures that are eager to run, and they are under enormous political pressure, like Tagiev, who's been a subject, one of the Southern politicians, been at risk of losing his parliamentary immunity and the source of demonstrations in the South. So there's going to be this building of political tension over the next days and months. And I think if the elite feels the tension is at risk of overflowing, they will try to find ways to negotiate among themselves to release it. Because I think that there is no force. There were forces, and I agree with Dr. Hamidov, that there were key forces in the country that were active in April and May of last year, and the government didn't read the situation right and didn't move quickly, the intergovernment, to stabilize the situation in the South in advance of these forces being able to push beyond. I don't think in the next year people are going to make that mistake. I think that the ending, it was painful to people ending the stalemate of the last 20 years in the South. Nobody is going to be interested in ending this much more fragile current stalemate in the South. So I think the elections become a real roll of the dice if they move forward. And it'll be interesting to see, as long as you're not living there in this moment of great interest, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I'm more confident that we're not going to see a repetition of last June in the next immediate future. There are always unpredicted events that could happen that would provoke it. If there was sudden destabilization in Uzbekistan for some reason, that would again change, if somebody suddenly died, that would change the political balance. But given in the absence of something unforeseen, I'm personally optimistic that we have a window in which to try to be more effective in working towards ethnic consolidation or ethnic reconciliation.
Can I just ask you, with regards to the police and other security personnel that have committed crimes against humanity or allegedly have done so, are you confident that they will be held to account individually and held and put into prison, for committing those crimes? Secondly, President Bakiyev, as we all know, is keeping a relatively low profile in Belarus. His current address, what residual influence does he have? And we also hear that Kyrgyz officials and ordinary people have accused the Uzbeks of seeking to create an autonomous region in Kyrgyzstan for Uzbeks. How do you rate those accusations? Are they credible?
We'll swap off. In terms of whether people will be held accountable, I think that this government and the president will make that attempt. If you're asking me to say whether they'll succeed, I think it is always hard to be optimistic that people will succeed in getting an only partially reformed judiciary to behave fully responsibly. So I think that some people, I hope, and think that a portion of those who should be held responsible will be held responsible, and that imperfection in doing this will hopefully serve as an inhibiting example. I say that as a realist who spent my whole adult life going to this region. Bakiyev, the autonomous region, the question of Bakiyev lying low, to me, the question, and this is another one of those topics that they talk about in the report, but they don't talk about enough because it's really hard, it's very hard to get people to talk about organized crime because people are frightened of being killed. And so when you ask these questions or the questions about Uzbek autonomy or any of those things, you're going into this area that people will talk about privately, but people are not comfortable talking about on the record or giving evidence about. I think that more important than the question of Bakiyev's influence is the presence of, there are still organized criminal groups in both countries, in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan. They've been under much better control in Uzbekistan than under Kyrgyzstan. There were alliances between some of these criminal groups, and if not the Bakiyev family, people who closely supported them. This is still there, and that's what I mean by keeping forces under wraps. There's nobody interested in inciting it. When you talk about an autonomous region, I don't ever believe that that was a serious issue, that the Uzbeks of Kyrgyzstan, who are Kyrgyz citizens who live their lives in Kyrgyzstan, ever had the goal of creating an autonomous region of the Fergana Valley dominated by ethnic Uzbeks. I think that when people talk about this, they're talking about it not hypothetically, but more elliptically. That what they're really saying, and I can't swear I'm right on this, is that they're frightened of organized crime groups at some point where there's regime change in Uzbekistan, where there's a transfer of power or where the Uzbek regime seriously weakens, that organized crime groups might join hands across borders and destabilize the whole area. So yes, politicians use the rhetoric of autonomous Uzbekistan, an Uzbek region there, but I think that's, I don't see any evidence of it. But is there a risk that destabilized Uzbekistan and destabilized southern Kyrgyzstan could create a pocket of lawlessness with a lot of Uzbek crime bosses, and no shortage of Kyrgyz, Russian, or Tajik crime bosses either. This is a very international organization. That, I think, is real and not something that one can ever put their hands on because it's just too dangerous to talk about, to reveal the identities of people.
Let me answer briefly. Regarding responsibility of security forces, central government finds itself in a bind. If the prosecution of these security forces, they will not have people who will support their regime. They are very weak. They are still fragile. Their control is still fragile, especially in the southern regions. And then there's this issue of who is not clean. Everybody has a fault in the violence. The security services, the provisional government. So if they really bring to accountability some security forces, there's this question of what about you? You are also complicit in those things. Regarding Bakiyev, he's toxic, meaning like nobody wants to affiliate with him. He's finished. One of the interesting things about Kyrgyz politics is that once people are removed from power, they are nobodies actually. So they don't have much influence except for money that they have perhaps pocketed and that they can ship to some people there. Regarding Uzbek autonomy or claims of autonomy, I've had many conversations with the Uzbeks and they tell me like, look, we lived in this country, they played a bad trick with us. If they, the Kyrgyz leaders, told us from the very beginning that, look, you are living in a Kyrgyz republic, just stop pushing for political rights, we would have gladly accepted it, or just like in Uzbekistan, where ethnic Kyrgyz accepted the Uzbek domination. And the Uzbeks are saying that, but they didn't do that. They say that the Kyrgyz government has allowed a lot of freedoms, they promoted ethnic minority rights, and that kind of encouraged them to be more demanding of certain political rights. As a result, this policy led to a collision with various nationalistic groups.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me just ask one final question, but I would like to let the record know that Ambassador Jumaliev has stayed throughout this entire hearing. We've had hearings before where as soon as their panel, the ambassador's panel was over, they're out the door. So I thank you for that courtesy, and again, for appearing here today. One final question with regards to the UN Human Rights Council as to whether or not they have listed this as an item for investigation and action to hold Kyrgyzstan to account. Have they done anything as far as you know? And if not, why not? Any idea?
No.
We'll pursue that and try to get an answer from the Human Rights Council, because it seems to me when the council was formed to replace the largely discredited Human Rights Commission, which only focused on Israel and more Israel and Israel and then some more Israel. We had promises that there would be very serious scrutinizing of nations, not just when they do periodic reviews, which all nations ultimately have to undergo, but when crises like this erupt. And hopefully, you know, it's never too late for them to undertake such an investigation, which will, I think, aid the efforts to give a full accounting and hopefully hold those who have committed crimes to account. Anything you'd like to add before we conclude? Again, I want to thank you for your very, very fine, incisive commentary and analysis. It is of extraordinary value to the Commission, and I want to thank all of you. Hearing is adjourned.